Incubus, the fallen angel of lust. You wake up in the dead of night, paralyzed. There's a weight on your chest. You can't move, can't scream. And then you see him, a dark figure looming over you, beautiful and terrifying all at once. His eyes burn into yours. You feel something you shouldn't feel, a pull, a desire that makes your skin crawl and your heart race. And then, just as suddenly as it began, he's gone. But you're not the same. You'll never be the same. Because last night, you were visited by an incubus, the fallen angel of lust. For thousands of years, across every culture, every continent, people have reported these encounters. Demons that come in the night, feeding on human desire, draining life force through sexual energy. The church called them fallen angels. Scientists called it sleep paralysis. But the victims, they knew the truth. Something was there. Something real. Something hungry. Tonight, we're going deep into one of humanity's oldest and most terrifying mysteries. We're talking about the incubus, the male demon of seduction and nightmare. Where did this creature come from? Why has every civilization feared it? What's the connection between lust, demons, and the darkest corners of human psychology? And here's the question that might keep you up tonight. What if the incubus isn't just a myth? What if there's something more to these stories, something that science and religion have both tried to explain but never fully understood? I've spent months researching this topic, diving into ancient texts, medieval manuscripts, modern testimonies, and psychological studies. What I found will change the way you think about desire, darkness, and the thin line between the physical and spiritual world. So turn off your lights, get comfortable, and whatever you do, don't look away. Because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the incubus has haunted humanity's nightmares for millennia. And you might just start questioning what visits you in your own dreams. Let's begin at the very beginning, in a time before time, when angels walked among the stars and the world was young. The story of the incubus doesn't start in medieval Europe or ancient Rome. It starts in the space between heaven and earth, in the moment of the greatest betrayal the cosmos had ever known, the fall. You've heard the story before, but you've never heard it like this. Because the incubus legend is intimately connected to the fallen angels, to Lucifer's rebellion, and to the moment when divine beings chose earthly pleasure over heavenly glory. According to Jewish mysticism and early Christian texts, before humans even existed, there was a war in heaven. Lucifer, the most beautiful of all angels, the morning star, led a rebellion against God. The reasons vary depending on which text you read. Some say it was pride. Lucifer couldn't bow to God's new creation, humanity. Others say it was jealousy, that Lucifer wanted to be worshipped as God was worshipped. But there's another version, a darker version that connects directly to our story. Some texts suggest that when God created humans, male and female, with bodies that could experience physical pleasure, some angels became fascinated, then obsessed, then corrupted by desire for these physical experiences they themselves could never have. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that didn't make it into the Standard Bible but was revered by early Christians, tells us about the Watchers. These were angels assigned to watch over humanity. But watching wasn't enough. Chapter 6 of Enoch describes how 200 of these Watchers, led by their chiefs Samiza and Azazel, looked upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful. They made a pact, a terrible pact, knowing that what they were about to do would damn them forever. They swore an oath to descend to earth, to take human form, and to take human wives. And they did. They came down on Mount Hermon, and they took human women as wives, and they taught humanity secrets that were meant to remain hidden. Azazel taught men to make weapons of war. Others taught women the art of makeup and seduction. They taught astrology, divination, the cutting of roots and plants for magic. But most significantly, They introduced humanity to forbidden knowledge and corrupted the natural order through sexual union. The offspring of these unions were the Nephilim, giants, monsters, beings that were neither fully human nor fully divine. And God saw this corruption and sent the flood to wipe the slate clean. But here's where it gets interesting for our story. When the flood came, the Nephilim died. But the angels who had fallen, who had corrupted themselves through physical desire, they couldn't die so easily. According to tradition, they became something else. They became demons. Specifically, they became the demons of lust, of carnal desire, of the night. They had tasted physical pleasure, had experienced the rush of human sexuality, and even in their fallen state, even cast down and transformed into demonic entities, they still craved it. They still hungered for it. This is the origin, according to ancient tradition, of the incubus, a fallen angel who became addicted to human sexual energy, who prowls the night seeking to experience again and again that which damned him in the first place. He's not just a demon. He's a cautionary tale about desire unchecked, about the corruption that comes from crossing boundaries that should never be crossed, about addiction that transcends even death and damnation. The word incubus itself comes from Latin. It means one who lies upon, or nightmare. The female equivalent is the succubus, from the Latin meaning to lie beneath. And while they're often spoken about together, the incubus has his own distinct characteristics, his own methods, his own terrible purpose. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's a great origin story, but it's just mythology, right? It's just ancient people trying to explain things they didn't understand. And you'd be partially right. But here's what makes the incubus legend so compelling and so terrifying. The encounters don't stop with ancient texts. They continue through every era of human history, described in eerily similar ways by people who had no contact with each other, no knowledge of each other's cultures, no way to coordinate their stories. Let me take you to ancient Mesopotamia, to the cradle of civilization, where some of the earliest written records of humanity mention demonic sexual encounters. In Sumerian mythology, there's a demon called Lulu and his female counterpart Lilitu. These were wind spirits, demons of the night who would visit people in their sleep. Lilu would prey on women, Lilitu on men, but both had the same purpose: to drain life force through sexual encounters, to produce demon offspring, and to corrupt human sexuality. And here's something fascinating. In these ancient texts, there are actual incantations, prayers of protection against these demons. People took this so seriously that they would write these prayers on clay tablets and place them in their homes. They would perform rituals before sleep. This wasn't a casual superstition. This was something people genuinely feared, something they took protective measures against because they or people they knew had experienced it. Move forward in time to ancient Greece and Rome, and you find similar stories. The Greeks had the Ephialtes, a demon that would sit on the chests of sleeping people, causing nightmares and, in some cases, sexual assault during sleep. The Romans adopted this into their own mythology and added layers to it. Roman physicians actually documented cases of women claiming to be visited by supernatural lovers in the night. Some of these women became pregnant and insisted their children were fathered by gods or demons. Society had to grapple with these claims. Were these women lying? Were they mad? Or was something else happening? The Roman poet Ovid wrote about these encounters. So did other classical authors. They treated it not as pure fantasy, but as a phenomenon that needed explanation, categorization, understanding. The philosopher and priest Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential Christian thinkers, wrote about incubi in his work, The City of God. He stated plainly that he believed these demons were real, that they genuinely appeared to humans, and that the evidence was too widespread to dismiss. Augustine argued that these weren't just dreams or hallucinations. He believed that incubi were fallen angels who had retained certain powers even in their fallen state, including the ability to take physical form and interact with the material world. He went further, suggesting that incubi could even father children, though not through their own seed. The theory was that an incubus could first appear as a succubus, collect seed from a human man, then transform into an incubus and use that seed to impregnate a human woman. Convoluted? Yes, but it shows how seriously the intellectual elite of the ancient world took these encounters. This brings us to a crucial point. The incubus legend persisted not because ignorant peasants believed in monsters under the bed. It persisted because educated, thoughtful people kept encountering a phenomenon they couldn't explain. Physicians documented it. Philosophers theorized about it. Religious authorities warned about it. And normal people, thousands upon thousands of them across continents and centuries, experienced it. Let me describe a typical incubus encounter, as told by countless witnesses throughout history. See if this sounds familiar to anyone who's experienced sleep paralysis or a particularly vivid nightmare. You're sleeping. It's the deepest part of the night, that hour when the world is at its quietest and darkest. Something pulls you from sleep, but not fully. You're in that liminal space between sleeping and waking, conscious but not fully alert. You try to move and realize with growing horror that you can't. Your body won't respond. You can't lift your arms, can't turn your head, can't even open your mouth to scream. Panic sets in. Your heart races. You can feel your pulse pounding in your ears. And then you sense it. A presence in the room. You can't see it yet, but you know something is there. The air feels heavier, charged with something electric and wrong. The temperature drops. Your breath comes out in visible puffs. And then you see him. He materializes from the shadows. Or maybe he was always there and you're only now able to perceive him. He's beautiful in a way that makes your stomach turn. Perfectly formed features, but cold, predatory. Eyes that gleam with an intelligence that's ancient and inhuman. Sometimes he appears as a handsome man, exactly the type you'd find attractive. Other times, there's something slightly off, something not quite right. Maybe his eyes are too dark, pupils blown so wide there's no iris visible. Maybe his skin has an odd texture or color. Maybe his movements are just slightly wrong, too fluid or too angular. He approaches the bed. You try to scream and can't. You try to fight and can't. He's on top of you now, and there's a weight on your chest that makes it hard to breathe. His face is close to yours, so close you should feel breath, but don't. And then the assault begins. It's sexual in nature, but unlike any physical encounter. It feels like he's draining something from you, pulling energy or life force or your very essence out through the contact. Some describe pleasure, intense and overwhelming and wrong. Others describe only violation and terror. Most describe a confusing mix of both. The encounter can last seconds or hours. Time becomes meaningless. And then, as suddenly as it began, it's over. The presence vanishes. The weight lifts. You can move again. You gasp for air, your heart hammering, your body covered in sweat. The room is normal again. Empty. No signs anyone was ever there. And you're left wondering, was it a dream? A hallucination? Or did something genuinely visit you in the night? This description, with minor variations, appears in medieval manuscripts, Victorian case studies, modern internet forums, and everything in between. The consistency is remarkable. And here's what makes it even more interesting. Before modern communication, before the internet, before books were widely available, people in isolated communities were having these experiences and describing them in nearly identical ways. How do you explain that? The medieval period is when incubus lore really exploded into the cultural consciousness. The Catholic Church was at the height of its power, and it took the threat of demons very seriously. Incubi and succubi were not only considered real, but were thought to be one of the primary ways Satan corrupted humanity. Sex was already viewed with suspicion by medieval Christianity. It was a necessary evil for procreation, but a source of sin and temptation in every other context. So a demon whose entire purpose was to seduce humans and lead them into sexual sin? That was the perfect enemy for the medieval church. Theologians wrote extensively about incubi. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest theological minds of the medieval period, wrote about these demons in his Summa Theologica. He argued that incubi were real fallen angels who could assume corporeal form to engage with humans. He wrestled with the question of whether demons could actually experience physical pleasure or whether they visited humans for other reasons, perhaps to humiliate humanity, to steal their vital essence, or to produce offspring for nefarious purposes. The theory about incubi fathering children became particularly important during this period. If a woman became pregnant out of wedlock, she might claim an incubus visited her. Now, this could be a convenient lie to avoid punishment for adultery. But the church and civil authorities took these claims seriously. They investigated them. They brought in theologians and physicians. Because if an incubus had genuinely fathered the child, that child might be something dangerous, something demonic. There are documented cases of women being tried, sometimes even executed, because authorities believed they had willingly consorted with an incubus. The distinction was crucial. If you were an unwilling victim of demonic assault, you were blameless, a victim who needed spiritual help and prayer. But if you had welcomed the demon, if you had taken pleasure in the encounter, if you had invited it back, then you were guilty of demonic fornication, a sin that could earn you excommunication or worse. The famous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1486, dedicates significant portions to discussing incubi and succubi. This book, which became the handbook for witch hunters across Europe, argued that witches often had incubi as familiar spirits and lovers. It described in graphic detail how these demons would seduce women, bind them to Satan's service, and use them to corrupt others. The book claimed that incubi were incredibly common and that their influence was everywhere. This created a paranoia that swept across Europe. Any woman who had a sexual dream, any man who experienced nocturnal emission, anyone who woke in the night feeling strange or having unusual experiences, they were potentially under demonic attack. The church sold amulets, relics, and prayers of protection. They performed exorcisms. Priests would bless homes and bedchambers. Holy water was sprinkled. Crucifixes were hung above beds, all to ward off the incubus. But here's the thing. Despite all these protections, despite all the prayers and holy water and crucifixes, the encounters continued. People kept reporting them. And not just crazy people, not just attention seekers, but nuns, priests, nobility, peasants, men, women, young and old. The phenomenon was universal. Let me tell you about one particularly well-documented case that illustrates just how seriously these encounters were taken. In the 14th century, there was a woman named Alice Keidler from Kilkenny, Ireland. She was a wealthy woman, married 4 times, and each of her husbands had died under mysterious circumstances. Her children from her first marriage accused her of witchcraft, claiming she was poisoning her husbands and using sorcery to increase her wealth. During the investigation, witnesses came forward claiming that Alice had a demon lover who visited her regularly, an incubus named Art, or Robin Art's son. According to testimony, this demon would materialize in Alice's chamber, appearing sometimes as a black dog, sometimes as a black cat, and sometimes as a dark man. Alice allegedly made offerings to this demon, performing rituals and giving him her sexual devotion in exchange for wealth and power. The case became one of the first major witch trials in Ireland. Alice fled before she could be tried, but her servant Petronella de Meath was flogged, excommunicated, and burned at the stake. Petronella confessed under torture that she had witnessed Alice's encounters with the incubus. Now, was any of this true? Or was it a case of family jealousy, property disputes, and the all-too-human tendency to accuse successful women of witchcraft? We can't know for certain. But what's significant is that the idea of a demon lover was not only believable to medieval people, but was considered a genuine threat worthy of investigation and punishment. Stories of saintly women being attacked by incubi are also common in medieval literature. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, Saint Thomas Aquinas, Saint Catherine of Siena, and many others reportedly experienced demonic sexual assault. These weren't seen as failures of faith, but as tests, attacks from Satan trying to corrupt those who were most pure. The more holy you were, the more likely you were to be targeted by an incubus. It was a spiritual battle, a war for the soul, and the battleground was the bedchamber. Here's where things get psychologically interesting. Medieval monks and nuns, who had taken vows of chastity, reported frequent encounters with incubi and succubi. These were people who had rejected sexuality, who had committed themselves to celibacy, and yet they were plagued by intensely sexual dreams and experiences that felt utterly real. They would wake to find physical evidence of sexual activity, despite having been alone and chaste. How did they explain this? Demons. It had to be demons. Modern psychologists would point to sexual repression, to the way denied desires manifest in dreams and unconscious experiences. But put yourself in the position of a medieval nun. You've devoted your life to God. You've renounced all worldly pleasures. And then you have an intensely erotic dream that feels absolutely real, that leaves you physically aroused and confused and guilty. You can't admit to having these desires. They shouldn't exist. So the only explanation that makes sense, the only explanation that preserves your identity as a chaste servant of God, is that you were attacked. A demon did this to you. You're not at fault. You're a victim. This psychological framework allowed people to acknowledge and discuss sexual experiences and desires within a cultural context that otherwise forbade such discussion. The incubus became, in a sense, a pressure valve for repressed sexuality. It provided a language for experiences that couldn't otherwise be spoken about. But before we dismiss the whole thing as just medieval sexual repression and religious hysteria, let's jump forward to the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, when science began to challenge religious explanations for natural phenomena. Did the incubus legend fade away as humanity became more rational and scientific? Not at all. It just transformed. Physicians in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries documented hundreds of cases of patients reporting nocturnal demonic encounters. They began to look for medical rather than supernatural explanations. Was it a disorder of the humors? An imbalance in the body's natural fluids? Was it caused by diet, by eating certain foods before bed that caused nightmares? Was it related to melancholy or madness? Some doctors theorized that incubus encounters were a form of hysteria, particularly in women. The uterus, they believed, could wander around the body, causing all sorts of problems, including sexual dreams and phantom sensations. This theory is absurd to modern medicine, but it shows that educated people were trying to find rational explanations for a phenomenon that was clearly real to those experiencing it. Other physicians focused on nocturnal emissions in men and spontaneous orgasms in women as physiological events that the sleeping mind then constructed narratives around. Your body has a natural sexual response during sleep, and your brain, in that liminal state between sleeping and waking, creates a story to explain what's happening. That story draws on cultural expectations and fears. In a Christian medieval context, that story involves a demon. But here's what these early medical explanations couldn't account for: the paralysis, the sense of presence, the weight on the chest, the absolute terror, and the consistency of details across cultures that had no contact with each other. If it was just sexual dreams plus cultural storytelling, why were the details so specific? Why did people across different continents in different time periods describe the same sequence of events, the same sensations, the same type of entity? Let's talk about sleep paralysis, because this is the modern scientific explanation most commonly offered for incubus encounters. Sleep paralysis is a real phenomenon. It occurs when your brain wakes up before your body does. During REM sleep, the phase where most dreams occur, your body is naturally paralyzed to prevent you from acting out your dreams. Usually, when you wake up, this paralysis lifts immediately. But sometimes, there's a disconnect. Your consciousness turns on, but your body stays in sleep mode. You're awake, aware, but completely unable to move. This is often accompanied by hallucinations. Because your brain is still partially in dream mode, you might see, hear, or feel things that aren't there. And because you're paralyzed and can't fight or flee, your fear response goes into overdrive. Your brain tries to explain why you can't move and why you're so terrified, and it conjures up a threat. In different cultures, this threat takes different forms. In Western cultures with Christian backgrounds, it might be a demon or dark figure. In other cultures, it might be a ghost, an alien, a witch, or an old hag sitting on your chest. The weight on the chest is also explainable. During REM sleep, your breathing becomes shallow and irregular. If you wake during this phase while still paralyzed, it can feel like something is pressing down on you, making it hard to breathe. The sense of a presence in the room is a known feature of sleep paralysis. Many sufferers report feeling absolutely certain that something malevolent is nearby, even if they can't see it. Neuroscientists believe this is related to how your brain processes threats and social presence. So there you go. Mystery solved, right? Incubus encounters are just sleep paralysis combined with cultural narratives about demons and sex. Science explains it all, and we can file the incubus away under interesting historical superstitions. Except that explanation doesn't quite cover everything. First, not all incubus encounters happen during sleep or involve paralysis. There are reports of people being wide awake, fully mobile, and still experiencing encounters with entities they identify as incubi. Second, sleep paralysis doesn't explain the physical evidence some people claim to find after encounters: scratches, bruises, marks that weren't there before. Third, it doesn't explain cases where multiple people in the same location report similar experiences with the same entity. And here's the big one that science struggles with. It doesn't explain why the encounter so often has a specifically sexual component. Yes, REM sleep is associated with arousal and nocturnal erections in men and increased vaginal blood flow in women. But why does the hallucinated threat take the form of a sexual predator specifically? Why not just a generic monster or attacker? Why is the experience so consistently eroticized across different people and cultures? Some researchers suggest it's because sleep paralysis triggers deep, primal fears, and sexual vulnerability is one of humanity's most profound anxieties. The idea of being paralyzed and assaulted touches on fundamental fears about bodily autonomy and violation. The brain, trying to make sense of what's happening, draws on these deep-seated fears and creates a narrative around them. But there's another layer here that we need to discuss. In the realm of psychology, and particularly in the study of the unconscious mind, the incubus takes on a different kind of reality. Carl Jung, the famous psychologist who broke from Freud and developed his own school of analytical psychology, wrote about demons and supernatural encounters as manifestations of the unconscious mind. He believed that the psyche contained not just personal unconscious content, personal repressed memories and desires, but also a collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the mind that all humans share. In this collective unconscious, Jung theorized, there are archetypes, universal symbols and patterns that appear across all human cultures. The shadow is one such archetype, representing the dark, repressed, rejected parts of ourselves. The anima and animus represent the inner feminine and masculine aspects of our psyche. And in Jung's framework, the incubus could be understood as a shadow figure, specifically one connected to repressed or denied sexuality. When you reject or repress parts of yourself, Jung argued, they don't disappear. They go into the shadow, into the unconscious, where they gain power and autonomy. They can then appear in dreams and visions as separate entities, often threatening or seductive. An incubus encounter, in this psychological reading, is your own repressed sexual nature confronting you, demanding acknowledgement. It feels like a separate being because you've split it off from your conscious identity. It's terrifying because you're being forced to confront desires and aspects of yourself you've denied. This interpretation is fascinating because it makes the incubus real without making it supernatural. It's not a fallen angel or an external demon. It's a part of you, a psychological reality with genuine power to affect your mental state and even your physical experiences. People who have undergone Jungian analysis and integrated their shadow often report that nightmares and disturbing dreams stop, including encounters with demon-like figures. By acknowledging and accepting the repressed parts of themselves, they remove the need for those parts to appear as threatening separate entities. But Jung also left room for something more mysterious. He believed that the psyche was not entirely contained within the brain, that consciousness might extend beyond the physical body in ways we don't fully understand. He documented cases of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggested some kind of connection between inner psychological states and external events. And he never quite ruled out the possibility that some of the entities people encountered in the depths of the psyche might have a reality beyond just being psychological constructs. So we're left with a fascinating question. Is the incubus a demon, a psychological phenomenon, or somehow both? Can something be subjectively real, experienced as genuinely as any physical encounter, but not objectively real in a material sense? And where's the line between those categories anyway? Let's talk about modern encounters, because the incubus didn't disappear when the medieval period ended or when science provided alternative explanations. People are still reporting these experiences today. I've read hundreds of first-hand accounts from the past few decades. They appear on paranormal forums, on Reddit threads about sleep paralysis, in letters to paranormal investigators, in sessions with psychologists and therapists. The language has changed. People might say they were visited by an entity, a spirit, a dark presence, or even an extraterrestrial. But the core experience remains remarkably similar to accounts from 1,000 years ago. Here's a modern account I came across that's typical of the genre. A woman in her 30s, professional, educated, not particularly religious or superstitious, started experiencing strange occurrences in her apartment. She would wake in the night feeling watched. Objects would be moved. She had vivid dreams of a tall, dark man standing at the foot of her bed. Then one night, she woke up unable to move, and he was there, not as a dream but present in her room. She describes him as beautiful but wrong somehow, and she felt a mixture of terror and unwanted arousal as he approached her bed. The encounter was brief but intensely physical. She felt like she was being drained of energy, left exhausted and disturbed. This woman went to a doctor who diagnosed sleep paralysis and prescribed better sleep hygiene. She tried therapy to deal with stress that might be causing the episodes. But the encounters continued. They became more frequent. She felt like this entity was becoming attached to her, that he was seeking her out specifically. She had friends stay over who reported feeling uncomfortable in the apartment, sensing a presence. One friend claimed to see a dark shadow moving in the bedroom. Finally, the woman moved out of the apartment, and the encounters stopped. Was it sleep paralysis exacerbated by stress and an unfamiliar environment? Possibly. But why did it feel so consistently like an entity with intentionality, with a personality, with specific wants? Why did other people sense something in that apartment? And why did leaving the physical space in the encounters if it was purely a psychological phenomenon? Another modern account comes from a man who identified as completely straight but started having recurrent dreams of a male entity seducing him. These dreams were incredibly vivid and began to affect his waking life. He felt ashamed and confused, wondering if this meant he was repressing homosexual desires. But the encounters didn't feel like expressions of his own sexuality. They felt like invasions, like something external was imposing these experiences on him. He sought help from a paranormal researcher who suggested he might be dealing with an incubus. They performed a cleansing ritual in his home, and the dreams stopped. Again, psychological explanation? Sure. Maybe the ritual provided psychological closure that allowed him to move past whatever internal conflict was manifesting as these dreams. Or maybe there was something genuinely external that was driven away. We can't know for sure. What we can say is that the experience was real for him. It caused genuine distress, and addressing it as a potential entity rather than just a psychological issue is what provided relief. There's also been interesting research into the connection between incubus experiences and the phenomenon of entity attachment studied by some parapsychologists. The theory goes that certain entities, whether you understand them as spirits, demons, thought forms, or something else, can become attached to a person's energy field or aura. They feed on emotional energy, particularly fear and sexual energy. Once attached, they can influence thoughts, dreams, and even physical sensations. An incubus, in this framework, is an entity specifically attracted to and feeding on sexual energy. People who believe they have entity attachments often report symptoms beyond just nightmares. Chronic fatigue, unexplained depression, obsessive sexual thoughts, relationship problems, and a general sense of something being wrong. Paranormal practitioners who work with entity removal report that after cleansing rituals, people experience immediate relief from these symptoms. Now, a skeptic would say this is just the placebo effect. If you believe a ritual will help you, it probably will, regardless of whether any supernatural entity was actually involved. And that's a fair point. The power of belief is profound. If you're suffering from psychological distress and a ritual or prayer gives you a sense of control and resolution, that can be genuinely healing even if nothing supernatural occurred. But here's where I want to challenge you to think beyond the simple binary of real versus not real, supernatural versus psychological. What if the incubus is a phenomenon that exists at the intersection of these categories? What if it's an experience that's shaped by psychological factors, cultural narratives, and sleep physiology, but also potentially by something we don't yet understand about consciousness and reality? Consider this. Quantum physics has shown us that observation affects reality at the subatomic level. Consciousness appears to play a role in collapsing quantum wave functions. We don't fully understand consciousness or where it comes from. We don't know if it's purely a product of brain activity or if it might be something more fundamental to the universe. There are serious scientists exploring ideas like panpsychism, the theory that consciousness is a fundamental feature of all matter, not just something that emerges in complex brains. What if entities like the incubus exist in some liminal space between mind and matter? What if they're thought forms that take on a kind of reality through belief and fear? What if the collective human unconscious, millions of minds over thousands of years believing in and fearing these entities has given them a kind of existence. Not physical existence in the way a table or chair exists, but a reality nonetheless, one that can interact with human consciousness in profound ways. This might sound like metaphysical speculation, and it is, but it's worth considering because it might explain why both the supernatural and the psychological explanations feel partially right, but incomplete. An incubus might be a psychological phenomenon that has developed a kind of autonomous existence through centuries of human belief. It might be a pattern in the collective unconscious that individual minds tap into during vulnerable states like sleep paralysis. It might be both internal and external, subjective and objective, imaginary and real. Let's shift gears and talk about the cultural impact of the incubus legend. This entity has had an enormous influence on art, literature, and popular culture. During the Romantic period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when artists and writers were fascinated by the dark, the supernatural, and the erotic, the incubus became a popular subject. Henry Fuseli's painting The Nightmare, created in 1781, is one of the most iconic images associated with the incubus legend. It shows a woman sprawled across a bed in a pose of abandon or unconsciousness, while a grotesque demon squats on her chest. From behind a curtain, a horse's head emerges with wild, glowing eyes. The painting is both disturbing and strangely erotic, capturing the mixture of violation and dark sexuality that characterizes incubus encounters. It caused a sensation when it was first exhibited and has been endlessly reproduced and referenced in horror art ever since. Gothic literature embraced incubi and succubi. These demons appeared in vampire stories, which themselves are deeply connected to the incubus myth. Think about the vampire archetype, a seductive entity that comes in the night, penetrates the victim, and drains life force, leaving the victim weak but strangely thrilled by the encounter. The vampire is essentially an evolution of the incubus legend, relocated from Christian demonology to folklore and given a more romanticized narrative. Dracula, the most famous vampire of all, is in many ways an incubus figure, aristocratic, seductive, predatory, moving through the night to claim victims who are both terrified and aroused by his presence. In modern horror, the incubus appears regularly. Movies like The Entity, based on a supposedly true story, depict violent spectral rape. The film Rosemary's Baby features a nightmarish encounter where the protagonist is raped by a demonic entity and gives birth to the devil's child, a plotline directly drawn from medieval fears about incubi fathering children. More recently, films like The Nightmare, a documentary about sleep paralysis, explore the phenomenon with interviews from sufferers and recreations of their encounters that draw heavily on incubus imagery. Even in mainstream media, the sexy demon has become a trope. TV shows feature demons who seduce humans, sometimes as villains, sometimes as anti-heroes, or even romantic interests. The incubus has been sanitized, made safer, turned into a bad boy character who's dangerous but alluring. This is a far cry from the terrifying, soul-damning entity of medieval legend, but it shows how the archetype persists and evolves with cultural attitudes toward sexuality. The transformation of the incubus from pure horror to something that also carries an element of fantasy and desire is interesting. It reflects changing attitudes towards sexuality. In a sexually repressive culture, the incubus is purely terrifying, representing forbidden desire that must be rejected. In a more sexually liberated culture, there's room to fantasize about the dark seducer, to find titillation in the idea of being overwhelmed by supernatural passion. The horror remains, but it's mixed with allure. This brings us to a fascinating subculture of people who don't view incubi as enemies at all, but as lovers, as spiritual partners. There are online communities of people who claim to be in relationships with incubi or succubi. They perform rituals to attract these entities. They communicate with them through meditation or automatic writing. They describe ongoing sexual and emotional relationships with beings they understand as demons or spirits. These people, who might identify as demonolators or spirit workers, have a completely different framework for understanding incubi. They don't see them as fallen angels trying to damn humanity. They see them as misunderstood entities, spirits of sexuality and passion who were demonized by Christianity, but who are actually neutral or even positive. Some argue that incubi and succubi are simply sex spirits, entities from a spiritual realm who are drawn to human sexual energy and can form mutually beneficial relationships with humans. In this framework, an incubus can be a teacher, a protector, or a lover. The sexual encounters aren't assaults, but consensual interactions between human and spirit. People in these relationships report benefits, increased confidence, better sex lives with human partners, spiritual growth, and a sense of connection to something beyond the mundane world. They also report challenges: jealousy from the spirit when they have human relationships, the difficulty of explaining to others what they're experiencing, and sometimes struggles with the intensity of the connection. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether this is real or delusional, whether these people are having genuine spiritual experiences or are creating elaborate fantasies. What I find fascinating is that the same entity, the incubus, can be understood in such radically different ways depending on the cultural and personal framework you bring to it. To a medieval monk, an incubus is a demon trying to drag you to hell. To a modern psychologist, it's a manifestation of the unconscious. To a parapsychologist, it might be a spirit or entity with its own independent existence. To a demonolator, it's a potential partner and ally. All of these interpretations are dealing with the same core phenomenon: the experience of encountering a sexual, supernatural entity, but the meaning and response to that experience varies wildly. This tells us something important about the nature of reality and experience. We don't encounter raw, unmediated reality. We encounter reality through the filters of our beliefs, expectations, and cultural narratives. Two people can have nearly identical experiences and interpret them in completely opposite ways based on those filters. And both interpretations might be valid for the person experiencing them. Reality, especially when we're talking about subjective experiences like dreams, visions, and encounters with the numinous, is more fluid and more dependent on the observer than we usually acknowledge. Let me tell you about the physiological effects of incubus encounters, because whether you believe these are supernatural or psychological, the physical impact is very real. People who experience repeated encounters often report chronic sleep deprivation. If you're afraid to go to sleep because you might be attacked, or if you're regularly waking in terror during the night, you're not getting quality rest. Sleep deprivation has serious health consequences: weakened immune system, impaired cognitive function, increased risk of depression and anxiety, and even increased mortality risk over time. There's also the issue of sexual dysfunction. Some people who experience incubus encounters report changes in their sexuality. They might find themselves unable to be aroused by human partners, or conversely, might experience hypersexuality. The boundary between their dream life and waking life becomes blurred. They might have intrusive sexual thoughts or fantasies that feel alien, not like their own desires. This can damage relationships and create significant psychological distress. Then there are the physical marks that some people find on their bodies after encounters: scratches, bruises, bite marks that weren't there when they went to sleep, but are there when they wake up. Skeptics explain these as self-inflicted during sleep or as marks that were already there, but only noticed after a disturbing dream. That's probably true in many cases. But some people report marks that are extensive and in patterns that would be difficult to create on oneself. Parallel scratches down the back, handprint-shaped bruises on thighs. These physical signs, whatever their origin, add to the trauma of the experience. The psychological toll is perhaps most significant. The violation of experiencing sexual assault, even if you're not sure whether it was real or a nightmare, is profound. Many survivors of incubus encounters describe symptoms consistent with PTSD, hypervigilance, intrusive memories, avoidance behaviors, and difficulty trusting. They might avoid sleeping alone or in the dark. They might struggle with intimacy because the encounters have associated touch and sexuality with violation and terror. And there's often an element of gaslighting, both from oneself and from others. If you try to tell someone you were attacked by a demon, most people will dismiss you as crazy or attention-seeking. Even if you frame it as a nightmare or sleep paralysis, people often minimize the impact. It was just a dream, they say. Dreams can't hurt you. But anyone who's experienced a truly traumatic nightmare knows that's not true. Dreams can absolutely hurt you. They can leave psychological scars that are as real as any physical injury. So whether you believe in literal demons or not, we should take seriously the suffering of people who experience these encounters. They need support, not dismissal. They need help processing the trauma, not mockery for believing something that our culture has decided is impossible. Let's talk about protection and prevention, because throughout history, people have developed methods for defending against incubi. If you're suffering from these experiences, whether you interpret them as supernatural or not, these practices might help. At minimum, they provide a sense of agency and control, which is psychologically valuable even if there's no supernatural entity involved. In Christian tradition, the primary defenses are prayer and holy objects. Praying before sleep, particularly to Saint Michael the Archangel, who is associated with protection against demons, is recommended. Keeping a Bible in the room, placing a crucifix above the bed, sprinkling holy water, and wearing blessed metals are all traditional protections. The idea is that these holy objects create a spiritual barrier that demons cannot cross. For those who follow these practices, they often report success. The encounters stop or become less frequent. Again, a skeptic would say this is because the ritual provides psychological comfort that reduces the anxiety and stress that contribute to sleep paralysis. And that might be exactly right. But if it works, does the mechanism matter? If prayer stops your nightmares, then prayer is effective regardless of whether angels literally intervened or whether you simply gave your nervous system permission to calm down. In folk magic traditions, there are other methods. Salt is considered protective in many cultures. Sprinkling salt around your bed or at thresholds is thought to create a barrier against negative entities. Iron is also traditionally protective against supernatural beings. Placing iron objects near the bed, under the pillow, or wearing iron jewelry might help. Herbs like sage, rosemary, and mugwort are burned or placed in sachets for protection. Some traditions recommend sleeping with mirrors positioned to reflect energy away from the bed, or using crystals like black tourmaline or obsidian that are thought to absorb negative energy. Again, whether these objects have any inherent supernatural protective properties is debatable, but the ritual of setting up protections, of taking active steps to defend yourself, is psychologically empowering. Modern sleep hygiene is also important. If incubus encounters are related to sleep paralysis, then practices that promote healthy sleep can reduce their frequency. This includes maintaining a consistent sleep schedule, creating a dark and comfortable sleep environment, avoiding screens before bed, limiting caffeine and alcohol, and managing stress through exercise and meditation. Regular exercise, particularly, is associated with reduced sleep paralysis episodes. For some people, sleeping position matters. Sleep paralysis is more common when sleeping on your back, so training yourself to sleep on your side might help. There are devices and techniques to prevent back sleeping if you find this reduces your episodes. Addressing mental health is crucial. Anxiety, depression, and PTSD are all associated with increased nightmares and sleep disturbances. Working with a therapist, particularly one trained in trauma or in techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy, can significantly reduce disturbing dreams and the distress they cause. If you interpret your experiences through a supernatural lens, finding a therapist who respects that framework rather than immediately dismissing it as delusion will be important. For those who take a spiritual approach, working with practitioners who specialize in entity removal or spiritual cleansing might be helpful. This could be a priest or religious authority in your tradition, a shaman, a root worker, a witch, or any other spiritual practitioner whose framework resonates with you. These practitioners can perform blessings, cleansings, and banishings designed to remove attached entities and protect against future encounters. I want to emphasize that you should seek help that aligns with your own beliefs, and that you should be wary of anyone who claims they're the only one who can help you or who demands large sums of money. Ethical spiritual practitioners will be transparent about their methods and realistic about what they can and can't do. And they'll work alongside, not against, any medical or psychological help you're receiving. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Throughout this exploration, we've danced around the central question: are incubi real? Do they actually exist as independent entities? Or are they just products of human psychology and physiology? I can't give you a definitive answer because honestly, I don't think anyone can. We're dealing with experiences at the very edge of human understanding, at the boundary between the physical and whatever else might exist. What I can tell you is this: the experiences are real. The fear is real. The impact on people's lives is real. Whether the cause is a literal demon, a psychological phenomenon, or something we don't yet have the framework to understand, the effect is the same. I lean toward a both and rather than an either-or explanation. I think sleep paralysis is real and explains many aspects of these encounters. I think psychological factors like repressed sexuality, trauma, and cultural conditioning play enormous roles in shaping the experience. But I also think there's room for something more, something we don't yet understand about the nature of consciousness and reality. I think it's possible that in vulnerable states, altered states like sleep paralysis or deep meditation, our consciousness might be able to perceive or interact with layers of reality that are usually hidden from us. Whether you call those entities spirits, thought forms, or something else, they might have a kind of reality that's neither purely material nor purely imaginary. The materialist scientific worldview, which says that only physical matter and energy exist and everything else is just brain activity, has given us enormous benefits. Modern medicine, technology, our understanding of the universe, all flow from that framework. But that worldview also has blind spots. It struggles with consciousness, with subjective experience, with anything that can't be measured and quantified. And it often dismisses experiences that millions of people have had as mere delusion or superstition. I think we need a more nuanced approach, one that takes seriously both the findings of science and the testimony of human experience. We can acknowledge that sleep paralysis is real while also acknowledging that what people experience during sleep paralysis feels absolutely real and has real effects on their lives. We can be skeptical of supernatural explanations while also remaining open to the possibility that reality is stranger and more complex than our current models suggest. The Incubus legend has survived for thousands of years because it touches on something deep and universal in human experience. It speaks to our fears about vulnerability, about sexuality, about the darkness that exists both around us and within us. It's a mirror that reflects back our anxieties about desire, about loss of control, about the thin boundary between pleasure and violation, about the possibility that we're not as alone as we think we are, that there might be other forms of consciousness sharing this reality with us. Every culture has developed their own version of this entity because every culture has had to grapple with the same fundamental human experiences: nightmares, sleep paralysis, sexual anxiety, the feeling of being watched in the dark, unexplained phenomena. The specific details vary, the names change, the explanations differ, but the core experience remains remarkably consistent. So what should you take away from all this? First, if you're experiencing encounters that you interpret as visits from an incubus or any similar entity, know that you're not alone. Countless people throughout history and today have had similar experiences. It doesn't mean you're crazy or cursed. It means you're having an experience that, while unusual and frightening, is part of the human experience. Second, seek help. Whether that's medical help for sleep disorders, psychological help for trauma or anxiety, spiritual help if that aligns with your beliefs, or all of the above. You don't have to suffer through this alone, and there are people and practices that can help. Third, trust your own experience. You're the expert on your own life. If someone tells you that what you experienced wasn't real, remember that all subjective experience is real to the person experiencing it. The terror you felt, the sensations, the impact on your life, all of that is valid regardless of what caused it. Fourth, protect yourself. Use whatever methods make sense to you, whether that's prayer, crystals, better sleep habits, therapy, or a combination of approaches. Taking action to defend yourself is empowering, and that empowerment itself can break the cycle of fear and vulnerability that feeds these experiences. And finally, stay curious. The universe is vast and strange, and human consciousness is complex beyond our current ability to fully understand. The fact that we don't have all the answers doesn't mean we should stop asking questions. The Incubus legend, whatever its ultimate nature, is part of the mystery of human existence. Engaging with that mystery, exploring it, trying to understand it, that's part of what makes us human. As we come to the end of this journey into the darkness, I want to leave you with one final thought. The incubus, whether demon or archetype or manifestation of the unconscious, represents something fundamental about the human condition. We are creatures caught between the physical and the spiritual, between our animal nature and our higher aspirations, between control and surrender, between the known and the unknown. We experience desires we don't always understand. We encounter aspects of ourselves and reality that terrify us, and we struggle to make sense of experiences that don't fit into our neat categories of real and unreal. The incubus is a symbol of all of that. It's the dark seducer that emerges from the shadows to remind us that we're not as in control as we'd like to believe, that there are forces, whether external or internal, that can overwhelm us. But it's also a reminder that we have the power to face our demons, literally or figuratively, to confront what frightens us, and to emerge stronger from that confrontation. So the next time you wake in the night, feeling that presence in the darkness, that weight on your chest, that mixture of fear and something else you can't quite name, remember this. You're experiencing something that humans have experienced for thousands of years. You're not alone in the dark. And whatever that presence is, you have within you the strength to face it, to understand it, and to reclaim your power from it. The incubus may be the fallen angel of lust, but you are not fallen. You're human, complex and contradictory, physical and spiritual, vulnerable and resilient. And that makes you far more powerful than any demon. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? A presence in the night, a dream that felt too real, an encounter that left you questioning the nature of reality? Share your story in the comments below. This is a safe space to discuss these experiences without judgment. You might find others who've had similar experiences, and together we can continue to explore these mysteries. If you found this video valuable, if it gave you insight or helped you feel less alone, hit that like button. It helps more people find this content, and it lets me know you want to see more deep dives into mythology, folklore, and the strange experiences that define human existence. And please, subscribe to this channel. We're building a community of curious minds who aren't afraid to explore the darkness, to ask difficult questions, to challenge easy answers. By subscribing, you'll be notified whenever I release a new video exploring the mysteries of human history, mythology, and the unexplained. We've got so much more to cover, from other demonic entities to legendary creatures, from ancient curses to modern hauntings, from the psychology of belief to the strange edges where science and the supernatural seem to overlap. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. I put enormous effort into researching these topics, finding primary sources, interviewing experts, and crafting videos that respect both the rational and the mysterious. Your support makes this work possible. Finally, share this video with someone who needs to see it. If you know someone who's struggling with nightmares or unexplained experiences, someone who's interested in mythology or folklore, or just someone who loves a good deep dive into the weird and wonderful, send them this link. Knowledge is power, and the more we understand about these ancient legends and modern experiences, the better equipped we are to navigate the mysteries of existence. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the legend of the Incubus, the fallen angel of lust. Thank you for your courage in confronting these dark topics, for your openness to considering different perspectives, and for your willingness to sit with uncertainty and mystery. In a world that often demands simple answers and easy categories, your curiosity and nuance are revolutionary. Remember, the darkness is not your enemy. It's the place where we grow, where we discover hidden truths about ourselves and our world. Don't be afraid of the shadows. Walk into them with eyes open and heart brave, knowing that understanding is always more powerful than ignorance, and that facing our fears robs them of their power over us. Sleep well tonight, and if something visits you in the darkness, if you feel that presence, that weight, that strange mixture of terror and desire, remember, you know what it is now. You understand the legend, the history, the possible explanations. You're not helpless. You're not alone. You're armed with knowledge, and knowledge is the greatest protection of all. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and never stop exploring the mysteries that make us human. This is your host, signing off. Sweet dreams, or if not sweet, then at least understood dreams. The darkness may be deep, but we'll navigate it together, one video at a time. Good night.